Richard Hayes raised his glass to celebrate 27 years of marriage, and only moments later he stood before more than 100 guests and declared that the marriage had been a mistake. In that instant, the crowded ballroom fell into a heavy silence, thick and unmoving like stone. But what no one in that room knew was that the woman he had just humiliated, Victoria Hayes, had already known everything for 3 weeks, and she had not come to that party to cry. She had come to finish a game. 3 weeks before that fateful night, Chicago was slowly slipping into autumn. The streets around Lincoln Park were covered in yellow leaves, and the wind carried a light chill that crept through every window frame. Inside the large 3-story house overlooking the park, Victoria Hayes woke up at around 3 o'clock in the morning. It was not the cold that woke her, but a sound, a whisper. She lay still in the darkness, her eyes opening slowly. A thin strip of light from the hallway slipped through the crack of the bedroom door. Richard was not lying beside her. The sound was coming from the hallway. Richard's voice, low, tense, hurried. "Everything has to be perfect." There was a short silence. Then he continued, almost whispering, "She must not suspect anything, not even a little." Victoria frowned. She recognized the voice on the other end of the line. Margaret Hayes, Richard's mother. The older woman said something Victoria could not quite hear, but she clearly heard Richard's response a moment later. "Yes, the party is the perfect time." Victoria remained perfectly still, not moving at all. She had lived with Richard for 27 years. She knew the rhythm of that man's breathing better than anyone, and the tone in his voice right now was not the voice of a husband talking about an anniversary celebration. It was the voice of a man preparing a plan. The bedroom door slowly opened, and Victoria immediately closed her eyes. Richard stepped inside quietly, as if afraid of waking her. He slipped into bed, but his body was tense. She felt it instantly, like a tight wire stretched between them, like a secret lying in the darkness of the room. The next morning, Richard seemed unusually cheerful. He walked into the kitchen with a wider smile than usual, the scent of expensive cologne filling the air. "Good morning, Vic." Victoria was pouring coffee, and she turned to look at him. Richard stepped closer and gently kissed her on the cheek, a gesture he had not done in months. "I was thinking," he said in a bright voice, "maybe we should have a big celebration this year." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "How big? Friends, colleagues, business partners, maybe more than 100 people." She looked at him for a few seconds. In all their 27 years of marriage, Richard had always hated family gatherings. He had once said they were a waste of time. Yet today, he suddenly wanted to throw a massive party. "I want to celebrate 27 years," Richard continued. "That's a big milestone." Victoria nodded slowly. "All right." Richard smiled with satisfaction and hurried out of the house. He forgot to take his phone with him. Victoria stood alone in the kitchen for a few minutes. The large house was quiet. Richard's phone lay on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, the screen lit up. A new message appeared. Victoria was not the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone. In 27 years, she had never done it. But that morning, something made her walk over. The sender's name was only a single letter, L. Victoria opened the message. The first line made her heart pound. "I don't want to hide anymore. When will you tell your wife?" Victoria felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She scrolled down. The next message was from Richard. "After the anniversary party, everything will be over." The party. Victoria stood frozen. The pieces began to connect inside her mind. The phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, the sudden enthusiasm about the party, the tension in Richard's voice. Another message appeared on the screen. "The lawyer has prepared the documents. She just needs to sign." Victoria slowly placed the phone back down. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood there, looking out the window, where yellow leaves were slowly drifting down onto the quiet street in front of the house. 27 years. She remembered the day they first met at Northwestern University. Richard had been a young man full of ambition, while Victoria was studying accounting, intelligent, calm, always knowing how to keep everything under control. They had built this life together, the house, the reputation, Richard's career. And now he was preparing to replace her with a girl named Elle. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the look in her eyes had changed. There was no surprise left, no pain, only a sharp and steady clarity. Richard believed he was preparing the perfect trap: a party, a speech, a shocking moment in front of hundreds of people, a humiliated wife too weak to fight back. Victoria allowed herself a small, quiet smile. What Richard did not know was that the game had just begun, and the woman he believed to be naive was actually the one holding the winning card. That morning, Richard Hayes looked suspiciously perfect. He moved around the spacious kitchen as if he were walking into an important meeting. His white shirt was perfectly pressed, his expensive watch caught the early sunlight and shimmered brightly, and his smile was too smooth. Victoria Hayes stood by the kitchen counter holding a cup of hot coffee. On the surface, she appeared calm, but in her mind, every word from the message she had seen the night before still echoed clearly, like pieces of metal striking together. After the anniversary party, everything will be over. Richard sat down at the dining table, opened his laptop, and typed a few emails. He looked unusually cheerful. "I've already booked the venue," he said without looking up. "Grand Harbor Hotel, the largest ballroom they have." Victoria lifted an eyebrow slightly. Grand Harbor was one of the most luxurious hotels in Chicago. A party there was far from cheap. "How many guests?" she asked. Richard shrugged as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "About 150 people." Victoria took a sip of coffee. 150 guests for a wedding anniversary celebration. That did not sound like Richard at all. This was a man who had once complained for an entire evening just because he had to attend a coworker's birthday party. But now he was the one planning a massive celebration, and Victoria knew exactly why. It was not an anniversary party. It was a stage. Richard was building the perfect stage to end their marriage in front of an audience. "Sounds like a great idea," Victoria said softly. Richard finally looked up. A flash of satisfaction crossed his eyes. He believed she suspected nothing. "I want people to remember that night," he said. Victoria looked straight into her husband's eyes. "Oh, I'm sure they will." Richard laughed and closed his laptop. "I have to leave early today. Meeting with the marketing team." Victoria nodded. "Good luck." Richard stood up, put on his suit jacket, kissed her lightly on the cheek, and walked toward the door. His black sedan pulled out of the driveway a few minutes later. When the sound of the engine completely faded away, the three-story house became strangely silent. Victoria stood still for a moment. Then she turned her eyes to the phone Richard had forgotten on the table. This time she did not hesitate. She picked up the phone and reopened the conversation with the name that consisted of only a single letter, L. Longer messages appeared on the screen. Lena. The name appeared in several earlier messages. Lena Brooks, 29 years old, the new assistant in Richard's marketing company. Victoria had met her once at a company party. A tall woman with blonde hair, a confident smile, and eyes that always looked at Richard as if he were the center of the world. Victoria kept reading. "I don't want to wait anymore," Lena had written in a message a few days earlier. "I don't like pretending to be just your employee." Richard had replied almost immediately. "Just a few more weeks. After the party, everything will be clear." Victoria scrolled further down. Another message made her stop. The lawyer said if she signs the property waiver, everything will go faster. Victoria exhaled quietly. So this was the real goal. Not just a divorce. Richard wanted her to walk away almost empty-handed. 27 years of marriage, and he was planning to erase it all in a single night. Victoria placed the phone back on the table. Her gaze grew deeper and colder. In her mind, the details began to arrange themselves like numbers in an accountant's ledger. Richard believed she was weak. He believed she was simply a wife who depended on her husband. But there was one thing Richard had forgotten. Long before he became a well-known marketing director, Victoria had been the one managing every number in their lives. She knew every loan, every contract, every investment, and she had signed most of the financial documents during the first 20 years of Richard's career. Victoria turned toward the laptop on her desk and opened it. Within minutes, she had accessed their joint bank account. The numbers appeared across the screen. Victoria stared at the most recent transaction. A large payment had just been made, $50,000. The recipient, Grand Harbor Hotel. She frowned slightly. Richard had paid for the party using their shared account. Victoria continued scrolling through the other transactions. Her eyes stopped on a smaller transfer, $1,500. The recipient, Lena Brooks. Victoria leaned back in her chair. A very thin smile appeared on her lips. Richard believed he was controlling everything, but he had already made his first mistake. He had left a trail, and Victoria Hayes had never ignored a wrong number in a ledger. She closed the laptop and stood up, walking toward the large window that overlooked Lincoln Park. Yellow leaves were still falling slowly in the wind. Outside, everything looked peaceful. But inside Victoria's mind, a plan was forming step by step with perfect clarity. Richard wanted to turn their anniversary party into the moment she would be humiliated. He wanted the whole world to watch her fail. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her eyes turning cold. If that was the game he wanted to play, then she would play it with him. But this game would not end the way Richard imagined. And when the night of that party finally arrived, the person who would leave the entire room in stunned silence would not be Richard Hayes. It would be Victoria. That afternoon, Victoria Hayes discovered that her husband's betrayal was not just an affair. It was a plan, and worse, it was a plan that had been prepared for a very long time. The house in Lincoln Park was strangely quiet. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the large glass windows and spilled across the pale wooden floor. Victoria sat at her desk with her laptop open in front of her. The screen displayed a list of bank transactions. She had been studying them for nearly an hour. Every number, every transfer, every tiny detail. And the longer she looked, the colder her eyes became. Richard was not just spending money on a party. He was spending money on a new life, a payment at a high-end jewelry store, a recurring transfer to an account under the name Lena Brooks, an invoice from a boutique hotel in downtown Chicago. Victoria remembered very clearly that during that week, Richard had said he was traveling for 2 days on business. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. 27 years of marriage suddenly played through her mind like a fast-moving film. The early years when they were still poor, when Richard was just a young marketing employee with dreams far bigger than the money in his pocket. Victoria was the one who helped him manage finances, plan investments, and pay off every small debt. She remembered their first apartment, so small that the dining table nearly touched the bed. But they had laughed a lot back then. Richard had once held her hand and said that one day he would give her a better life. And he had done it. But now Victoria was beginning to understand that success had changed him. A notification sound suddenly rang from the phone on the desk. Victoria looked down. A new message had appeared. Not from Richard, but from an unfamiliar phone number. The message was very short. "Hello, Victoria. I think you should know the truth about Richard." Victoria frowned. She opened the message. A photo was attached. In the picture, Richard was sitting in an elegant restaurant. Across from him was Lena Brooks. The young woman leaned slightly toward him, her hand resting on his, her expression intimate. The photo had been taken from quite close. Clearly, the person who sent it had been standing somewhere inside the restaurant. Victoria zoomed in on the image. There was no doubt anymore. Richard had not even tried to hide it. Another message appeared immediately afterward. "They meet often, almost every week." Victoria stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then she replied, "Who are you?" 3 minutes passed before the phone vibrated again, a person who does not like seeing others being deceived. Victoria let out a soft breath. The sender could be one of Richard's colleagues, or someone who worked in his company, or simply someone who happened to see them together. Whoever it was, the information only confirmed what she had already suspected. Richard was living 2 lives at the same time. Victoria placed the phone back on the desk, but her mind began moving faster. If Richard was bold enough to be this open, it meant he was confident his plan would succeed. The anniversary party, the speech in front of hundreds of guests, the divorce papers already prepared, and a wife so shocked she would not react in time. Victoria stood up and slowly walked to a small office on the 2nd floor. This room had once been where she worked when she was still the chief accountant for an architecture firm. Even though she had left the job several years ago, her habit of keeping records had never changed. A large filing cabinet stood against the wall. Victoria opened the 3rd drawer. Inside were neatly organized folders sorted by year. She pulled out a gray folder. On the cover was a simple line of text: Real estate assets. Victoria placed the folder on the desk and opened it. Inside were copies of numerous legal documents: the contract for purchasing the house in Lincoln Park, the bank loan records, and another very important document: a financial agreement signed more than 20 years earlier. Victoria flipped to the last page. Her signature, Richard's signature, and the signature of their family lawyer at the time. Victoria read again the clause she almost knew by heart. This house had been purchased using the trust fund her father left her before he passed away. That meant that according to the law, most of the value of the house belonged to Victoria, not Richard. A slow smile appeared on her lips. Richard believed he was preparing to push her out of this life with nothing in her hands. But he had forgotten one important detail. The woman he had underestimated for years was the one who understood every document in their marriage better than anyone else. Victoria closed the folder. Outside the window, the Chicago sky was turning the gray-purple shade of evening. Streetlights began turning on one by one. The city remained busy as it always was. But inside this small room, one truth had just become very clear. Richard Hayes believed he was controlling the chessboard. What he did not realize was that the queen on that board had never left Victoria Hayes's hand. And when that 27-year anniversary party began, the person who would leave the entire room stunned would not be the man planning the betrayal, but the woman he believed he had defeated long ago. Here's your translated text. That evening, Victoria Hayes did not call her husband. She didn't text him asking where he was or what he was doing. Instead, she did something Richard would never have guessed. She called her lawyer. Outside the window, the Chicago sky had darkened. Streetlights cast a soft yellow light on the streets wet from the light rain in the afternoon. In her small office on the second floor, Victoria sat up straight at her desk, holding the phone. She glanced at her contacts for a few seconds before dialing. The name on the screen was Daniel Foster, her old college friend, now one of the most prominent family law attorneys in Chicago. The phone rang 3 times. Victoria? Daniel's voice came through the line with a hint of surprise. It's been a long time. Victoria looked out the window, her gaze calm. Daniel, I need to meet you. As soon as possible. A brief silence. Daniel knew Victoria well. She wasn't the type to call a lawyer for trivial matters. How serious is it? He asked. Victoria replied in a very calm tone, My husband is preparing to divorce me. Daniel exhaled lightly on the other end, but Victoria continued immediately, and he plans to do it in front of 150 guests at our anniversary party. There was complete silence on the other end for a few seconds. I understand, Daniel said slowly. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. my office. The next morning, Chicago was colder than usual. Winds from Lake Michigan blew strongly through the downtown streets. Victoria entered the glass office building where Daniel worked. She wore a long gray coat, her silver hair neatly tied behind her. The receptionist recognized her immediately and smiled politely. Mr. Foster is expecting you. Daniel's office was on the 12th floor. The door opened when Victoria walked in. Daniel Foster stood up from his desk, his face showing both surprise and concern. Victoria, he said, I didn't expect us to meet again under these circumstances. Victoria sat down in the chair opposite him. Neither did I. Daniel poured her a glass of water and sat down. Tell me everything. Victoria didn't beat around the bush. She recounted the call at 3 o'clock in the morning, the messages in Richard's phone, the girl named Lena Brooks, and the anniversary party plan. Daniel listened intently without interrupting. When Victoria finished, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, thinking. If he plans to do this in front of so many people, Daniel said slowly, he probably thinks he has the legal upper hand. Victoria placed a folder on the desk. I think you should look at this. Daniel opened the folder. It was a copy of the house purchase contract in Lincoln Park. He read the first few lines, then frowned. Then he flipped through the pages quickly. His eyes stopped at the source of funds for the house. Daniel looked up at Victoria. His expression completely changed. Does Richard know about this? Victoria shook her head. I don't think so. Daniel slowly placed the folder back on the desk. Victoria, he's preparing a plan without fully understanding the situation. Victoria said nothing. Daniel continued. According to this document, most of the money for the house came from the trust fund your father left you. This means the property could be considered your separate asset under the law. Victoria nodded lightly. I remember that clause. Daniel chuckled softly. Clearly, Richard doesn't. He turned his chair toward the computer and opened a new note file. If he's planning to divorce and divide assets in his favor, he's standing on very shaky ground. Victoria looked at Daniel intently. I don't want to just defend myself. Daniel paused his fingers on the keyboard. What do you mean? Victoria leaned forward. Her voice was low but clear. Richard wants to turn the party into a stage to humiliate me. Daniel looked at her for a few seconds. He understood that look. It wasn't the look of a betrayed wife in despair. It was the look of someone preparing to counterattack. You want to turn the tables right at the party, Daniel said. Victoria nodded. Exactly. Daniel was silent for a few seconds, then chuckled lightly. I always remembered you as the smartest one in our accounting class. Victoria didn't laugh. Daniel opened a drawer and took out a notebook. If we're going to do this, he said, we have to do it precisely. He began writing down each point. Evidence of infidelity, financial records, ownership of the house, expenses from their joint account. Daniel looked up after a few minutes. Victoria, if we prepare this right, Richard Hayes won't be the one controlling the evening. Victoria stood up. Her gaze was as calm as a morning lake. He thinks he's writing the script, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. And you're about to change the ending. Victoria walked out of the lawyer's office, the cold morning wind blowing through the crowded street. But inside, she no longer felt the coldness of the night before. Because now, she knew one thing very clearly. Richard Hayes was preparing for an evening that would leave the entire room stunned. The only difference was that the one who would leave them speechless wouldn't be him. It would be Victoria Hayes. 3 days after the meeting with lawyer Daniel Foster, Victoria Hayes received an email that caused her entire plan to shift in a way she never expected. That morning, Chicago was gray and cold. Light drizzle fell on the streets around Lincoln Park, creating thin streaks of water on the dining room windows. Victoria sat alone at the table, her laptop open in front of her, the steam still rising gently from her coffee mug. Her inbox displayed a new email from an unfamiliar address. The sender was a law firm in London. Victoria furrowed her brow. She hadn't had any contact in England for years. She opened the email. The first line made her sit up straight. Dear Mrs. Victoria Hayes, we regret to inform you that Mr. Edward Lawson passed away last week in London. Victoria stared at the screen. Edward Lawson, her uncle, her father's younger brother, the one who had moved to London nearly 30 years ago and had almost disappeared from the family's life ever since. Victoria remembered him as a quiet, intelligent, and extremely secretive man. After her father's death, Edward had been the only one in the family to contact her a few times each year. But those calls had gradually dwindled over time. Victoria continued reading the email. The next lines caused her heart to slow in shock. According to the legal will of Mr. Thay Lawson, you are the primary heir to several assets, including an apartment in Kensington, London, and shares in Lawson Publishing. Victoria gently placed her hand on the table. She reread the passage twice to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. An attachment was included with the email. Victoria opened it. It was an asset summary. The estimated value of the London apartment was close to $3 million. The value of the shares in Lawson Publishing was around $1.3 million, a total of over $4.3 million. Victoria leaned back in her chair. In the quiet room, the sound of the rain tapping on the window was clearer than ever. $4 million. Not a small sum. But what made Victoria think was not just the value of the assets. It was the timing. Richard was preparing a party to publicly announce his divorce from her. He thought that after leaving this marriage, Victoria would lose most of the life they had built together. But now a new truth had appeared. A truth Richard was completely unaware of. Victoria smiled slightly. Not a smile of joy, but the smile of someone who had just seen another strong card in her hand. The phone on the table vibrated gently. A message from Richard. I'll be home late tonight. I have a meeting with a client. Victoria looked at the message for a few seconds. She could almost guess exactly where Richard was, perhaps at the familiar restaurant downtown, or a small hotel where Lena Brooks was waiting for him. Victoria didn't respond to the message. Instead, she picked up the phone and called Daniel. The lawyer answered after a few rings. Victoria? His voice was deep and focused as usual. I just received an email from London, Victoria said. I think you should hear this. 20 minutes later, Daniel sat in her office, his eyes fixed on the printed email and inheritance documents. He read each line very slowly. When he set the papers down on the table, his expression had changed. Does Richard know about this? He asked. Victoria shook her head. No. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together in thought. Victoria, if this information is correct, your situation is even more favorable than I thought. Victoria silently watched him. Daniel continued. Richard is preparing to divorce, thinking he'll have the financial upper hand. But if you own assets worth over $4.3 million, everything changes. Victoria stood up and slowly walked to the window. The rain outside had intensified. I don't want him to know beforehand, she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You mean keep it a secret until the party? Victoria turned back to look at him. Her gaze was calm but sharp. Richard wants to surprise me in front of everyone. A brief silence. Daniel understood her intent immediately. And you want that surprise to backfire on him? Victoria nodded. Daniel chuckled lightly. I'm starting to feel a little sorry for Richard. Victoria didn't laugh. Don't be too quick. She looked down at the inheritance documents on the table. This game isn't over yet. Outside, the sky over Chicago darkened as the afternoon passed. In the quiet house in Lincoln Park, Victoria Hayes stood by the window, the city lights reflecting in her calm eyes. Richard Hayes thought he was walking into an evening where he would end his 27-year marriage in the perfect way. But he had no idea that every step he was taking was leading him straight into a much bigger surprise than anything he had ever imagined. And when the evening of the party came, not just a marriage would end. The entire truth about Richard Hayes would also be exposed under the lights of the entire room. A week before their 27-year anniversary party, Richard Hayes began to reveal his true face. Not in front of colleagues, not in front of friends, but right in the house where Victoria had lived with him for nearly 3 decades. That evening, the weather in Chicago was cold and windy. The leafless branches outside the window tapped lightly against the glass as the wind from Lake Michigan blew through. Victoria was standing in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. When Richard walked in, he tossed the car keys onto the table with a sharp clink. His suit still carried the familiar scent of expensive cologne, but his face no longer had the fake cheerfulness of the past few days. Richard looked around the kitchen as if evaluating something. We need to talk, he said. Victoria turned around, her hand still resting on the kitchen counter. About what? Richard pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, exhaling deeply. Victoria, I think it's time we were honest with each other. Victoria looked at him, her gaze calm. That made Richard feel a little uneasy. He had imagined this moment differently. He thought she would be confused, or at least scared. But Victoria stood there, calm as if she were listening to a weather report. Honest about what? Richard crossed his arms. Our marriage is not what it used to be. Victoria didn't answer. Richard continued. We've been together for too long. Everything's become dull. He paused for a moment and then spoke more bluntly. I think we both know that. Victoria placed the knife on the table. What are you trying to say? Richard looked directly into her eyes. I want a different life. His words fell in the room like a stone dropped in a still lake. But Victoria didn't waver. A different life, she repeated. Richard nodded. A life with more energy, more inspiration. He leaned forward, his voice growing sharper. Victoria, you've changed. You're not the woman I married 27 years ago. Victoria looked at him for a few seconds. In her mind flashed the images of the messages between Richard and Lena, the secret dinners, the small hotels, the promises of a new future. Richard continued, as if justifying himself. I need someone who understands my ambitions, someone who can keep up with my life now. Victoria tilted her head slightly. You mean someone younger? Richard didn't deny it. He shrugged lightly. Age isn't the issue, but energy is. A brief silence filled the kitchen. Outside, the wind continued to blow harder. Richard stood up, walked over to the wine cabinet, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. I think we should end this civilly, he said. There's no need to make things awkward. Victoria watched his every move. Richard took a sip of whiskey and continued. After the anniversary party, I'll announce my decision. He said it so calmly, as if he were announcing a business plan. Victoria raised an eyebrow. In front of everyone. Richard turned to look at her. I think that's the best way. No rumors. No misunderstandings. He set the whiskey glass down on the table. And then we'll handle the divorce. Victoria slowly walked to the dining table. She pulled out a chair and sat down opposite him. You've spoken to a lawyer. Richard froze for a second, but quickly regained his composure. Of course, Victoria nodded. And you think everything will go according to your plan? Richard smiled confidently. I always prepare well. Victoria stared at him for a long time. There was no anger in her eyes, no tears, just an unsettling calm. Richard felt a bit uncomfortable with that calmness. He had expected a stronger reaction. Aren't you going to say anything? He asked. Victoria smiled faintly, a smile so slight it was almost unnoticeable. If that's what you want. Richard was a little surprised. Is that it? Victoria stood up and turned back to the kitchen. We've lived together for 27 years, Richard. If you think this is the right decision, I won't stop you. Richard watched her for a few seconds. Part of him felt relieved. He thought everything would be easier than he expected. But something about the way Victoria spoke made him uneasy. A calmness that was too much. As if she had known about this for a long time. Richard shook his head, telling himself he was overthinking it. He couldn't know that at that very moment, everything he said had become part of Victoria's larger plan. Because when Richard Hayes walked into his 27-year anniversary party, he believed he was the one in full control. But he had no idea that the woman cooking dinner behind his back had prepared a much bigger surprise for that night. And when the party lights lit up, Richard Hayes' confidence would turn into something entirely different. A deathly silence before hundreds of gazes. And this time, the one controlling that moment wouldn't be him. It would be Victoria Hayes. 3 days before the anniversary party, Richard Hayes felt that everything was going according to his plan. He stepped out of the office building in downtown Chicago late in the afternoon as the winter sun was slowly fading behind the towering glass buildings. In his vest pocket was the draft of the divorce papers prepared by his lawyer. Richard wasn't in a hurry. He enjoyed the feeling of control. In his mind, the evening of the party had been clearly imagined. A luxurious room, over 150 guests, wine, warm lighting, and then the moment he would stand up to give a speech. A polite, calm, and civilized speech. And then he would announce that his marriage to Victoria had come to an end. People would be surprised. Some would whisper. But in the end, everyone would understand. Richard Hayes, the successful man, was turning a new chapter in his life. He smiled at the thought of it. His car turned onto a small street near downtown. A cozy Italian restaurant sat at the corner, its yellow lights spilling onto the sidewalk. Richard walked in. Lena Brooks was already seated at a table by the window. She wore a simple black dress, her long brown hair softly cascading over her shoulders. When she saw Richard, she smiled brightly. "You're here," she said. Richard pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "I couldn't miss dinner with you." The waiter brought wine to the table. Lena leaned forward, her eyes full of curiosity. "Is everything ready?" Richard lifted his wine glass, swirling it lightly in his hand. "Almost perfect." Lena chuckled lightly. "I still don't believe you're going to do it at the party." Richard shrugged. "I want everything to be clear." Lena studied him for a moment. "Victoria will be shocked." Richard took a sip of his wine. "Maybe." He said it nonchalantly. Lena lowered her voice. "Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything?" Richard laughed softly. "Victoria always lives in her own world. She doesn't notice the little changes." Lena nodded, seemingly satisfied with that answer. But Richard didn't realize that somewhere else in the city, Victoria Hayes was doing the complete opposite of what he imagined. In a quiet cafe near the Chicago River, Victoria sat across from Daniel Foster. On the table between them was a small recording device. Daniel pressed the stop button and turned off the device. "The sound is very clear," he said. Victoria nodded lightly. The recording contained the entire conversation between her and Richard 3 days ago in the kitchen. Every word Richard said about ending the marriage, about wanting a new life, About making the announcement in front of everyone. Daniel looked at Victoria intently. Are you sure you want to use this? Victoria looked out the window of the cafe. The Chicago River flowed quietly between the tall buildings. I haven't decided yet, Daniel nodded. But you want to have it in hand. Victoria turned back to him. Richard thinks he's controlling the story. Daniel smiled slightly. But you're rewriting that story. Victoria didn't answer. In her mind, she pictured the banquet room at the hotel where the anniversary celebration would take place. Round tables covered with white cloths, sparkling glasses of wine under the lights, and Richard standing in the middle of the room, confidently thinking he was the one controlling that night. Daniel closed the recorder and placed it into his briefcase. Victoria, I have to ask again, he said. Are you sure you're ready for that moment? Victoria looked straight into his eyes. I've been ready for a long time. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Lena placed her hand on Richard's. After the party, date everything will be different. Richard looked at her and smiled. In his mind, he had already painted a picture of a new future. A modern apartment in the city center, spontaneous trips, a younger woman full of energy standing by his side. He had no idea that at that very moment, he was getting closer to the moment when all his plans would crumble before the eyes of the entire room. Because when the party began, Richard Hayes would walk onto the stage with absolute confidence. But he didn't know that somewhere in that room, Victoria Hayes had prepared a truth he couldn't control. And when that truth was revealed, the entire room would fall silent. Not because of Richard's speech, but because of the woman he had underestimated, Victoria Hayes. The night of the anniversary party finally arrived. The hotel where Richard Hayes hosted the celebration was located in the heart of Chicago, a luxurious building with a glass facade reflecting the city lights. Inside the grand ballroom on the top floor, crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light over the round tables covered with pristine white cloths. More than 150 guests had arrived. Richard's colleagues, old friends, a few business partners, and even neighbors who had known the Hayes family for many years. The soft sound of piano music echoed from the corner of the room. Glasses of red wine were continuously served. The atmosphere resembled that of a perfect wedding anniversary party. Richard Hayes stood near the bar, chatting with two colleagues. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his hair neatly combed. The smile on his face was as confident as ever. But inside, a feeling of excitement was slowly building. This was his stage. In just a few minutes, he would stand in front of the entire room and say the words he had prepared for weeks. On the other side of the room, Victoria Hayes had just arrived. She wore a simple but elegant deep blue dress. Her short silver hair was neatly styled, shining softly under the chandelier light. When Victoria entered, a few guests turned to look, not because of any showiness, but because of the strange calmness radiating from her. Victoria greeted a few acquaintances with a slight smile. On the outside, she looked like any wife attending her own anniversary party, but on the inside, everything had been meticulously planned. Daniel Foster stood near the door to the ballroom, wearing a simple gray suit. He held a briefcase in his hand. He looked at Victoria and gave a slight nod. Victoria responded with a subtle nod of her own. No one in the room noticed that silent exchange. Finally, Richard saw his wife. He walked over with a polite smile. "You're here," he said. Victoria looked at him calmly. "Of course. This is our party." Richard didn't catch the subtle emphasis in the last two words. He gestured toward the room. "Quite a crowd, huh?" Victoria looked around. The tables were nearly full. Laughter and conversation filled the room. "You've prepared very well," she said. Richard smiled proudly. "I always do things thoroughly." Victoria nodded lightly. "I know." Meanwhile, in a corner of the room near the small stage, Lena Brooks had arrived early. She was sitting with a group of Richard's friends, wearing a striking red dress. Her eyes occasionally glanced toward Richard with a secretive smile. She, too, was waiting for that moment, the moment when Richard would publicly end his marriage and open up a new future with her. Victoria spotted Lena immediately, but she didn't seem surprised. Just a fleeting glance, then she turned away. Daniel, standing nearby, observed the entire room. He noticed Lena. He also noticed the look Victoria gave the young woman, but Victoria remained completely calm. That only made Daniel more certain that everything was going exactly according to plan. The music in the room slowed as the event manager stepped up to the small stage at the front of the room. He took the microphone and smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to celebrate the 27-year anniversary of Richard and Victoria Hayes. Applause echoed throughout the room. Richard turned to Victoria. "It's time," he whispered. Victoria looked at him, her eyes deep and unreadable. Richard stepped onto the stage to applause. He took the microphone from the event manager and turned to face the guests. The room gradually grew quiet. Richard took a deep breath. The moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. His voice rang clear in the large room. Victoria stood beneath the stage, her hand lightly resting on the arm of the chair. Daniel stood a few steps away from her, his gaze focused. Richard continued his speech. 27 years ago, Victoria and I began our journey together." A few guests smiled. A few nodded in agreement. Richard paused for a second. Then he spoke more slowly. "But sometimes in life, we must be honest with ourselves." The room began to quiet further. Victoria looked up at the stage. The light from the chandelier reflected in her eyes. Richard had no idea that in just a few minutes, the entire room would no longer follow the story he was about to tell. Because right after he said the next words, Victoria Hayes would step onto the stage. And in that moment, the anniversary party Richard had prepared for weeks would turn into something entirely different, a moment no one in that room could forget, especially Richard Hayes. Richard Hayes stood on the stage with a microphone in his hand, the golden light from the chandelier shining down and illuminating his face in the middle of the spacious room. More than 150 guests were looking toward him. Some were smiling, some were raising their glasses of wine. In their eyes, this was still an ordinary wedding anniversary celebration. Richard took a deep breath and continued his speech. 27 years is a long journey, he said, his voice deep and steady. During that time, Victoria and I have shared many memories, successes, difficulties, and many changes. He paused for a moment. The room was quiet. Richard looked around as if carefully choosing his next words. But sometimes in life, we must accept that things cannot remain the same forever. A few guests began glancing at one another. There was something in Richard's voice that made them feel the atmosphere beginning to shift. Richard continued, "People change. Life changes. And sometimes we must be brave enough to step into a new chapter." Below the stage, Victoria Hayes stood still. Her hand rested lightly on the back of a nearby chair. Her expression was so calm it was almost cold. Daniel Foster stood a few steps away from her, his eyes following every movement Richard made. In the corner of the room, Lena Brooks leaned slightly forward. She knew exactly what was about to happen. Richard finally said the words he had prepared. "Tonight, in front of all our friends and colleagues, I want to say that Victoria and I have decided to end our marriage." The room fell silent. Not a gentle silence, but a heavy one. A few whispers began to move among the tables. Richard stood straight, feeling a surge of adrenaline rush through his body. This was his moment, but just as he prepared to continue, a voice rose from below the stage. "Richard." The voice was not loud, but it was clear enough to make the entire room turn toward it. Victoria Hayes stepped away from where she had been standing and walked toward the stage. Her steps were slow, calm, and confident. Richard froze for a second. He had not expected this. Victoria walked up the small stairs leading to the stage. The event manager standing nearby looked confused but could not react in time. Victoria stepped beside Richard. She looked at him, then turned toward the room full of guests. "I'm sorry, everyone," she said gently. "I think I should also say a few words." Richard looked at her, forcing a polite smile. "Victoria, this isn't necessary." Victoria lifted her hand slightly. "Just 1 minute." She turned toward Richard. "You don't mind, do you?" Richard could not refuse in front of the entire room. Reluctantly, he handed the microphone to her. Victoria took it. The stage lights fell on her face, making her silver hair shine like polished metal. She looked around the room. More than 150 pairs of eyes were following every movement she made. Victoria began speaking in a very calm voice. "Richard is right. 27 years is a very long time." She paused for a second. "And during those 27 years, I have learned one very important thing." Richard stood beside her, beginning to feel a growing sense of unease. Victoria continued, I have learned that sometimes the person you trust the most can become someone you no longer recognize. A few guests began exchanging looks. Richard frowned slightly. Victoria turned her head and looked at Richard for a brief second, then faced the room again. 3 days ago, Richard told me that he wanted a new life, a life with more excitement. In the corner of the room, Lena Brooks suddenly felt her heart beating faster. Victoria continued speaking, and I completely respect that decision. She gave a very small smile, but I believe everyone here deserves to know the full truth. Daniel Foster stepped forward from below the stage. In his hand was a briefcase. When Richard saw Daniel, he immediately felt the blood in his body turn cold. Victoria turned to Daniel. Daniel. Daniel opened the case and took out a small device, a voice recorder. Victoria looked back at the room. Before Richard announces his decision tonight, perhaps everyone should listen to a short conversation. Richard stepped forward. Victoria, what are you doing? But Victoria did not look at him. Daniel pressed the play button, and in the quiet room, Richard Hayes' voice began to play clearly from the small speaker. It was his voice. Every sentence about wanting a younger woman, every sentence about how his marriage had become boring, every sentence about his plan to announce the divorce in front of everyone. The room was completely silent. There were no whispers, no clinking glasses, only Richard's voice echoing through the space. Richard stood frozen on the stage, and for the first time that entire evening, he realized a terrifying truth. This party was no longer his stage. It belonged to Victoria Hayes. Richard Hayes' voice from the recorder echoed through the luxurious room like a blade slicing through the air. Every sentence he spoke about boredom, about wanting a younger woman, about the plan to announce a divorce in front of everyone, rang out so clearly that no one could pretend they had not heard it. When the recording ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. The piano music had stopped. The clinking of wine glasses had disappeared. More than 150 people stood or sat frozen, their eyes shifting from Victoria to Richard. Richard stood on the stage as if he had turned to stone. His face had gone pale. For the first few seconds, he seemed unable to understand what had just happened. Then the truth struck him like a wave of cold water. Everyone had heard it. Every single person. Victoria Hayes stood beside him, still holding the microphone. Her face was so calm that it was almost impossible to read her emotions. She looked out across the room full of guests and spoke slowly. I think everyone understands the situation. A few guests began whispering to each other. Others simply stared at Richard with disbelief. In the corner of the room, Lena Brooks sat stiffly in her chair. Her face turned bright red with embarrassment as several people nearby began glancing toward her. Richard finally managed to speak. Victoria, you have gone too far. Victoria turned to look at him. Her eyes held no anger, no bitterness, only calmness. Really? Richard stepped closer, trying to keep his voice low so he would not lose control in front of the crowd. You are turning a private matter into entertainment. Victoria tilted her head slightly. You were about to announce our divorce in front of 150 people. She paused for a moment. I simply thought everyone should hear the full story. A few uneasy laughs came from the audience below. They were not joyful laughs, only awkward ones. Daniel Foster stood below the stage observing the entire scene. He could clearly see the change in the guests' expressions. Earlier, they had looked at Richard with the respect reserved for a successful businessman. Now those looks had turned into something else, suspicion and disappointment. Victoria continued speaking into the microphone, her voice still calm. Richard says he wants a new life, and I respect that. She turned her head toward Richard, but I also want him to understand something. Richard looked at her, his face tense. Victoria continued, that new life will not begin the way you think. The room fell silent again. Victoria turned toward Daniel. Daniel. Daniel stepped onto the stage, opened his briefcase, and took out a stack of documents. When Richard saw those papers, his heart began pounding harder. Daniel handed the documents to Victoria. She held them up slightly. Over the past few weeks, I have spoken with my lawyer, Victoria said, and we have reviewed all of our family assets. Richard frowned. Victoria continued. The house in Lincoln Park, the investment accounts, and a few legal clauses that perhaps Richard has forgotten. Daniel stepped toward the secondary microphone placed near the stage. According to the financial records and the original purchase contract, he said clearly, most of the money used to buy the current house came from the personal trust fund of Mrs. Victoria Hayes. A wave of whispers spread through the room. Daniel continued, that means the house is legally the private property of Mrs. Hayes. Richard stood motionless. Victoria looked at him, her voice soft but sharp. So after the divorce, Richard will need to find a new place to live. A few guests could not help letting out small laughs. Richard felt his face burning. But Victoria was not finished. She placed the documents down and continued. And there is one more thing. The room fell silent again. Victoria spoke slowly. Last week I received notice from London that my uncle had passed away. Richard frowned again. Victoria continued. According to his will, I am the primary heir. She paused for a second. The total value of the estate is approximately $4.3 million. A louder wave of murmurs spread across the room. Richard felt as if the floor beneath him had disappeared. Victoria looked directly into his eyes. So, Richard, she said gently, you are completely free to begin the new life you want. She handed the microphone back to him. But you will have to begin it without me. Victoria turned and walked down from the stage. The entire room watched her in silence. Richard remained standing there, holding the microphone without being able to say a single word. Outside the glass windows, the Chicago night was dark and cold. But inside the elegant banquet hall, a truth had just been revealed. The woman Richard Hayes believed he could easily walk away from had actually been the one holding the real power in this story all along. And sometimes in life, the strongest moment is not when you take revenge on someone, but when you stand tall, speak the truth, and walk away without looking back. If this story made you think about respect, about self-worth, or about standing up when you are underestimated, share your thoughts in the comments. And do not forget to follow the channel to hear more powerful stories like this. Tonight's story does not end with an argument, not with loud revenge, but with something much simpler, the truth. Victoria Hayes did not need to shout, she did not need to create a scene, and she did not need to prove her strength by putting someone else down. She simply stood there, spoke the truth, and allowed the truth itself to change everything. Sometimes in life, people underestimate you simply because they believe you will stay silent forever. But when you understand your own value, when you remain calm enough to stand firmly in your position, real strength naturally appears. And that was exactly what made the entire room fall silent that night. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about the way Victoria handled that situation? And what would you do if you were in a similar situation? Do not forget to like the video if you want to watch more dramatic and inspiring stories like this. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the new stories shared every week. Because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way we look at life.